Well, good morning. Just had an interesting little chat with the wife. Um, I think I explained that there is someone I ran into recently who teaches French to grade school kids, but their French is so English that it makes it very difficult for me to speak French with them because she's saying French words, but with such an incredible English accent, it just breaks me out of the whole thing. But so this is what we were talking about, and the wife doesn't believe that learning French was helpful, but she was taught what I told you, that core French that I took just by accident. And yeah, it wouldn't have made me like French either. But as I've explained before, we don't learn algebra so that we can be algebrists, or is it algebraists? We learn it so that it can help us. And in fact, again, further to a discussion we were having about Nicholas Taleb's book, both The Black Swan and Anti-Fragile, he plays on this idea, which is a major idea that I agree with. How do you handle a black swan moment? How do you handle something that's new, it's different, it's novel, to use a fairly cliche recent turn of the phrase? Well, it's like Schopenhauer said, that we learn another language so we can separate words from ideas. I'm not saying that all of us should be learning another language to use. I mean, look at how we used to teach Latin and Greek. It's not so that we can speak. It's so that, for example, I was just looking up a Greek word, Hygies. Hygies. It's from the Bible, John 5:6. This is one of my favorite passages, this idea. There was a gentleman who was lying by the pool of Bethsaida, depending on the translation. And so the story goes that he was lying there for 38 years waiting to crawl to the water to be healed. And the reason why I was looking this up is I was surprised to come to learn that just like Greek, Hygies, or Hygies, is a word meaning to be whole, to be complete. And so I looked up the German translation of John 5:6, and I was surprised to see that, no, they're using Gesamt, a different version of to be whole or to be complete, because there's an awesome word in German that would be perfect. Vollstandig, which means to be whole, to be complete. Yeah, so it surprised me to see that it wasn't chosen as the word. But what I love about that is it's the difference between, healing a little to be completely healed, and how it goes from the idea of illness or being incomplete. Very Jungian in this idea of integration or individuation, right? Understanding who and what you are aside from maybe your sufferings or because of them, right? Vicissitudes. But it's my favorite because this parable, it doesn't even have to have anything to do with real life. How many of us are like that gentleman in John 5:6, lying by the pool for 38 years because, oh my gosh, I can't make it to the pool. Everyone's faster than I am, or no one's helping me, or I need to wait for an angel to stir the waters of the pool to heal me. When in reality, all it took was for him to get up and carry his own mat. And this is what surprises me. This is the story that I would give, not even about Christ and carrying his cross, because that is really hard to picture yourself as Christ. I think this is why in the story there's Simon carrying the cross as well, so we can picture ourselves carrying someone else's burden. But we have such a hard time picturing ourselves carrying our own burden. And this is why I like John 5:6, because it shows that this gentleman, once again, could be healed by just carrying his own burden. But as we see further on, it shows how so many of us fail at this. We need someone else to tell us to heal ourselves, that he ends up, again, accusing someone else of, being the reason why, well, that he's up and walking and he is ambulatore. Again, and a Latin word that was used to translate Hygies, to be complete, to be whole, right? Ambulatore. We get ambulance, but more so to be ambulatory, to be able to get up and walk around. Right? I love that idea that it's so Buddhist in the idea that awareness, mindfulness, focus, to be present, to be complete, to be whole, to be aware, is this idea of to be whole, to be present, but also to be your agent. This is Karma Yoga from the Bhagavad Gita, which I'll be taking a course tomorrow on, right? It'll be our 6th week, and I think 6th or 7th week, and we're on chapter 7. It's awesome. I mean, this course could be 50 weeks long, and it would still not cover everything, I'm sure. But I just found that to be so poignant. I mean, I did a podcast a couple weeks ago about would you be whole? And I guess it falls on deaf ears because so many of us want to take a pill, or we want to think that something external from ourselves, either belief or otherwise, would be the thing that could bring us this wholeness, this completeness, this healing. It's funny. It's funny. As I learn more and more languages, I'm shocked to find out how limiting the English language is. I often use the words, I don't even want to bother, but I often use words showing how we've lost our understandings, but worse yet, how there are so many other languages that have words that have fallen out of use. I mean, even the German Vollstandig hasn't been used since 25 years ago. So it's fallen out of favor. And I've used the example of Vicissitudes that for 30, 40 years didn't have the full translation of not just the negative, but that's the good and the bad, both. How do we define? Depends on perspective, and we know not the way of things. For, I mean, what do you know? Things you do may have been for a reason. That's why I argue clarity. But I'll leave it at that. I just wanted to share this idea that, you learn another language. You learn some of these complicated ideas, not so that you can be a specialist in that one area, but so that it can inform the other areas of interest and prepare you for such a time that what they would call a black swan event, something that was unexpected. And how do we surmount something like that? We can't just go by a template or a stencil, right? We have to adopt a new modus operandi, our usual way of operating, because something new and different has happened. Don't mind the chattering blinds here. We're getting some nice weather for once, right? I mean, it's funny, just to give you an idea of how silly it may be. We were watching a YouTube channel about Paris, and they were complaining about how the sun goes down early at certain times of the year, and other times of the year it's long. Well, this is because they came from Florida, and just prior to that, they were explaining how Paris can get cold in the winter, and so they only had running shoes. And so they're explaining this like the majority of people lived in the Caribbean like they did. They lived in southern Florida. So you lived in the tropics, pretty much. The majority of people don't live in the tropics, certainly not that are watching your YouTube channel. In fact, the majority of them will be Northern European, Atlantic, North Atlantic even. Right? You're closer to Pacific. Right? So this is what I'm getting at here. It's not only do people have a hard time expressing themselves, but even worse, so many people don't know what other people don't know. It's an idea in psychology that, right, we should outgrow this. Just children are the ones that don't know what other people don't know. The funny example is you have a child that just came home from an amusement park, and they'll come running up to any old stranger, telling them about their adventure. But they don't realize that the stranger doesn't know the context. They didn't know that they just went to an adventure park. So if they're talking about something, right, the context is lost. But that's something we're supposed to outgrow. And we're supposed to have a sense of doubt. Right? Those are the greatest forecasters, those with a reluctance to believe that their theories are absolutely correct, always looking to transvaluate all things, not just values. And I think this is what's happening. I mean, if, as I said the other day, we think visually, and the only way that we can get these ideas out, collaborate, and understand where we're coming from would be language. What happens if the language no longer expresses what we mean it, or it just is limiting as opposed to liberating? Right? I give the example of a Group of Seven painter, A.Y. Jackson. And one of his paintings, one of my favorite paintings, is called Terre Sauvage. And the painting is of I think a pine tree or something on a peninsula being battered by the winds, by the elements. And you can see this because it has grown to be, distorted in its shape. But what's beautiful about this is it cannot be said, like I said, from the Hebrew to the Greek, right? For love, chesed, needed 4 words. Hygies, a word that means wholeness, completeness, needed 4 words in the Greek to translate. We've even invented words to translate some of these concepts, but, well, I guess really it's interesting language. Could it be blamed, or is it our laziness? I think this goes back to Emerson. It shocks me to realize it is beyond just reading. It's beyond just learning and thinking, but it's also how we go about thinking. Right, the language, how we translate thoughts, visual ideas into words, into language, and share them with each other. How we can understand other people's concepts. I mean, that's how you can surmount a black swan event. You can't do it with just your own experience, right? That certainly won't work. What you need is access to all sorts of other experience through books, through stories, narratives, right? Just like the parable in John, John 5:6. This idea, when you have a sense of doubt, that really all you need to do is have confidence in your own ability, your own innate skill set. Like I said, a lot of these philosophies that we believe are not to help us in our day-to-day life, but they're a toolkit to help us rebuild, right? Rebuild. There's another one of those synonyms that was used to translate the Greek word hygies, or completeness. This idea of rebuilding, right? It's also within many different philosophies, this idea of rebuilding oneself. We're constantly rebuilding oneself. There's a philosophy idea of we're like a boat on the seas, right? Where you can't rebuild everything all at once, right? You can only build it piece by piece over time. The example I've heard used is like a plane in flight, and you're rebuilding it as you're flying, right? You can only do so much without risking your flight worthiness. Or in a ship, the idea is, right, if you were to pull too many boards from the hull, you're going to sink. So it's a process. It's little bit, and that's the sad part. I think Basil van der Kolk highlights this in his Body Keeps the Score, his book on trauma. But this idea that why it's so hard for us to become whole, to heal completely, is because, well, self-limiting beliefs. We also don't feel that we have the potential, the ability to heal ourselves. We talked about this with gurus. Why is it so many people turn to gurus rather than themselves? Why is the Pratyeka Buddha, the self-guided practitioner, why are they so rare? I've talked about this before. We warn people off of a self-directed path, right? Most people need a guru, but that's most, not all, right? It's just very rare that you'll find someone who is able to be their own guru. But the problem lies that everybody needs to be their own guru. In healing, I mentioned this just the other day. I was talking to a couple, and like I said, I used to have that, what do they call it, white coat syndrome or whatever. My blood pressure would be up because I had to travel so far to get my doctor. And, you know, we only have so much time, and I only get to go once in a blue moon. And so, of course, you're stressed out, your blood pressure goes up. But since I became the agent in my own healing, since I became the agent in my own education, my own understanding, since I became the person that vets whether what I hold to be true is error or not, I feel liberated, because even going to the doctor, he's a consultant now. He's a second opinion to my own, based on science. I mean, I'm lucky. I have access to a lot of the research online in the papers we can read. And like I've mentioned, I spent years learning how to read these research papers, something that doctors could do themselves, right? We could give them a course and teach them how to read this stuff. But the sad part is they're not trained. So, same idea, right? We do not know that to become whole, Vollstandig, to become healed, to become complete, only requires that we get up and carry our own mat. All it requires is us to become our own agent for change, our own agent for healing, our own agent for good. As Jung said, that's the only thing holding us back. He believed, and I agree, that we are predestined, predisposed to turn towards the good. Yes, we can create great evil. We have this potential, as Hannah Arendt said, this banality of evil. But the beauty is, as I've said for years now, what I love about the human experience is if you had a group of 100 people, it takes far more of those people to convince the others to do something bad than it would for even one person to convince the entire group to do something good. I think that proves that we default towards good works followed by good works. We default towards truth, turning towards truth. And I think the thing that's holding us back now is so many of these relativists don't understand that, like they've vilified populism, they've vilified relativism, they've vilified sophistry. They don't have to be evil if you manage how you use these things, right? Sophistry can be used for evil, but it is definitely one of the greatest tools that we can use for logic and reason, right? I mean, how can you come to Occam's razor? How can you come to a theory from a hypothesis without, as Jung said, if the error guides me better than what I held to be true, I'll be guided by the error. That's science, right? Wissenschaft in German is science, but it's to come to understand, not to understand finally and fully. No. This is different. This is an ever-evolving understanding or a rebuilding of what we used to understand to be true. That's exactly the same as the human experience, right? This, in Sanskrit, the chit or the chitta, our consciousness, our being, our construct of self, is an ever-evolving thing. As should be our language, our understanding of such, our understanding of each other. And I think there could be our lesson today. I guess, truly, learning other languages has nothing or very little to do with speaking other languages. I think it has more to do with a coming to understand. The science of linguistics, philology, is coming to understand ourselves. Right? This is, I think, as time goes by, I come to understand some of Nietzsche's brilliant parables and aphorisms more and more. He posited this thought experiment. Would we need language if we were lost alone in the woods? And I've always said that I think he may have been wrong, thinking that we wouldn't have need for language. But maybe I'm wrong, because the reason why I said he was wrong is because I thought we would still need language to come to understand ourselves and our world, right? This is what they argue, right? I think it's Wittgenstein who said that we externalize ourselves, like McLuhan would say, but in his case, he's talking about language. We use language to understand objects. But maybe Nietzsche was right in the sense that if we were alone in our thoughts and we didn't communicate outside of ourselves, would there be any need for words, for language? Because, like I said, I'm surprised that there's even a plurality of people who will say that they think in words, they think in language. I do believe that we think visually and default to explaining how we think. We use words as the default and confuse the difference between needing words to explain our thoughts and thinking itself being a visual activity. I wonder, and I love the fact that I think this is what Nietzsche meant, was for us to wonder, what is the nature of language? What is the nature of thinking? What is the nature of self and others? And I think that's a beautiful thing. I have no doubt that maybe he was also inferring the idea that could we be an individual? And this may be where Nietzsche influenced Jung. Could we find a way to integrate who and what we are without language, without another, right? As Martin Buber's I and thou, or the Bhagavad Gita teaches that it's within context that we develop who we are, right? Interaction with others. So I wonder whether maybe there isn't an answer to his question of whether we would need language if we were alone in the wilderness. I think maybe the question is the reason. It's not a search for answers, but it's a search. It's a search for no longer needing questions, no longer needing the answers. My apologies. That there may come a point where not that we have certainty, but that we have become so focused, so present, so aware that every choice we make, pisteo, right? We're convinced based on the best evidence at hand, and therefore, right or wrong, we can proceed without regret, winning or learning